Welcome to the 2021 AIA Austin Design Excellence Conference, Day 3. I am AIA Austin President Steffi Motal. By now you've had 2 days of informative courses, and this last day of the conference will be no different. In today's keynote, our esteemed speaker, Brion Oakes, our city's first ever Chief Equity Officer, will be introducing a powerful new equity assessment tool. What Brion has been working on is transformational to our city, and we all have a part to play in that positive change. Before we get started, I'd like to give a special shout out to our conference sponsors. We are grateful for their support of our profession and this conference. So please, before you're done with your conference today, take a moment to visit the sponsors and expo area in the Socio Conference platform. There's just a few of them and we really appreciate them. So go say hello and learn more about the products and services they provide. And now our featured speaker. As the first ever Chief Equity Officer for the City of Austin, Brion is responsible for working with the city leadership and the community to create an equity framework to be adopted by all departments and offices of Austin city government. As Chief Equity Officer, Oakes is responsible for facilitating dialogue and organizational practices that support the development and adoption of equity as a shared value. He serves as the technical expert in addressing equity as it is applied to citywide policies, programs, practices, and budget decisions, with an overall vision to make Austin the most livable city for all. Prior to his arrival to the City of Austin, Oakes served as the Vice President of Health Equity for 14 years at the American Heart Association's Southwest affiliate. He was the 2009 recipient of the Rome Betson Health Equity Award, and in 2010 received another prominent honor as a recipient of the National Cass Wheeler Integration Award to recognize his work in collaboration and integration across the American Heart Association. Mr. Oakes earned his Bachelor of Science in Political Science from University of Houston and Masters of Public Administration from Texas State University. Prior to a 14-year career at the American Heart Association, Oakes worked as a legislative assistant for State Representative Dora Oliva and as a project coordinator for the Texas Healthy Kids Corporation and the Texas Medical Foundation. Throughout his career, he has focused on improving health outcomes for minority communities and addressing disparities in access to healthcare services. Thank you, Brion. The mic is yours.
Thanks, Steffi. Good morning, everyone. Really glad to be here. And, you know, one of the questions I always get when I do presentations is people wonder around, you know, why did you get into this sort of, you know, field, or you know, why a career committed to health equity. And I always like to share a little bit of personal about myself to say that one of the most significant events in my life was losing a father at a very young age. He was only 49 years old and he died from congestive heart failure. And that really fueled my career at the American Heart Association. And I was motivated to really sort of focus on health equity because after my father's death, there was a lot of soul searching, but also a lot of learning around, you know, what sort of led to the premature death. And what I discovered on that journey was that so much of our built environment and our social environment really had the most impact on my dad's health. And I grew up in a neighborhood called South Park in Houston, that if we were talking to all of the, you know, social scientists, they would say it's a low socioeconomic neighborhood, concentration of families in poverty. And we didn't have things like a grocery store. You know, we probably didn't have enough green space or parks per capita. We lived in a concentrated area of fast food. And so all those things that we look at in the built environment that would actually lead to poor health outcomes. And I think for a long time that my dad struggled with his health. As a family, we never really truly sort of got or understood how the built environment, and in public health, we say those social determinants were really sort of driving the health outcomes that we see. And I think if you fast forward and you look at the city of Austin, it's very much the same, and we'll talk more in the presentation, but really sort of pushing the question is that why is it in the city we could have some zip codes that have 10 years less life expectancy? So what does our history tell us? How did we sort of come to be? What is it about our process of how we design and develop neighborhoods over the years that we have such sort of different health outcomes and life expectancy? So I always tell people that truly at heart, I'm a public health advocate. And I truly do this work around equity because I want families to ultimately be able to live longer and more vibrant lives and have more time than we had with my dad as a family. So I always say it's really personal for me in the work that I do. So today's presentation is that I really wanted to introduce you all to some of the concepts around equity. I think equity is sort of it's a real buzzword now. In local government, especially, we use it all the time. If you go to any city meetings, you hear us talking about equity, which I think is a good thing. But oftentimes, everyone in the room doesn't sort of always know what that entails. And so we'll talk today about, what does equity mean, especially what does it mean for our city? And I hope through the conversation that we have today, you'll also sort of see how you may be able to pull some of the principles and strategies that we're utilizing within the city of Austin, within your industry too, right? And we'll talk about a body of work that we're doing at the city of Austin through the use of equity assessment tools. And even though we use this tool at the city, it's something that we make available to all organizations. And so you could sort of see that there could be benefit in utilizing our tool within your company or within nonprofit organizations that you may be a part of. And we actually do some of that work, especially in the nonprofit sector with some of our community-based organizations where we've actually sort of loaned our tool out to them and encouraged them to use it as well to advance this work in what they do. So another thing to sort of mention is that this is probably going to be a different keynote presentation in that I want it to be interactive, and I want you all to sort of get involved in the conversation. And I'm gonna ask Steffi to help me a little bit with that, is that, I have some questions for you all. And I want you all to sort of answer and respond in the chat box. And so we'll kind of like talk about or list some of those answers out so that everyone can hear. But I always think that equity conversations are best when they're two-way conversations. And I always say that we learn from each other. And so as we do the presentation this morning, really want to encourage you all to kind of chime in and participate as well. And I'm going to go ahead and get us started for today. All right, so I'm going to play a little game that we do at the city. And it's a game that we call values versus reality. And so on the screen is a value that we have. And I want you all out in the audience to, in the chat box, tell me a little bit about this value. So all men are created equal. Where does this show up for us in US history and US government? See, many of y'all didn't know you're going to be in a civics lesson this morning. All men are created equal. So in the chat, where do we see this show up for us? And I'll ask, like, who wrote it? This is an easy one.
Maureen says, white landowning men, Bill of Rights, 14th Amendment is coming in.
Yeah.
Someone wanted to correct it to say all people are created equal.
Ooh, that's deep.
Declaration of Independence, question mark.
Yes.
Uh,
Right. So I think, yeah, you all got it. Declaration of Independence, coined by Thomas Jefferson. It's like a bedrock value of American government. I think you probably learned this as early as kindergarten, that all men were created equal, Declaration of Independence. It's a beautiful American value. But I think someone hinted on it in the chat box. Who can tell me what was the reality in 1776 when we coined this beautiful value of all men were created equal? What's happening in our nation?
Kendall said, when this was written, all men were not treated as equal, white landowners.
Right, white landowners.
Slave owners.
From, who else was excluded from this vision of all men being created equal? Mm-hmm. Any other?
Women could not vote. Slavery was enforced.
Right. We had institution of slavery, enslaved Black people. Indigenous folks were experiencing genocide, right? All these things going on. So beautiful value, but really our reality wasn't reflective of the value, right? So I have another one. This one's actually harder, right? Of the people, by the people, and for the people. Who wrote this? And it shows up in a famous speech that many of you may have actually had to memorize when you were in school. And I know we're virtual, so no cheating on you.
Yeah. Lincoln. Thomas Jefferson. Okay, yeah.
So Abraham Lincoln, Gettysburg Address, and of the people, by the people, and for the people. And who knows, like, what was Lincoln really sort of talking about? Like, how are we a nation that is of the people, by the people, and for the people? Like, what is it that we do as Americans to truly be this nation that is of the people, by the people, and for the people?
Vote.
We vote.
Vote,
yes.
vote.
We vote. Okay, but in 1865 or 64, I always get confused when Lincoln gave this address. Who could really vote? What was our reality?
Mm-hmm. Not everyone. White men, white men, white men.
Right, almost the same as the Declaration of Independence, right? And so what we saw in America was a history of really trying to sort of get to make this value really be true, right? To make it be real for us. And I wanted to know, so when did women get the right to vote in the United States?
1920s.
So 1920, I'm gonna ask, is that really true? Let's see if somebody in our audience will challenge 1920 as being true, that women got the right to vote.
White women, 1921.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So when did all women really get the right to vote in the United States?
1960s.
Yeah, 1965. It was the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so we sort of share this example a lot of times because when we talk about equity, and we'll talk more about it, sometimes people like to sort of take other areas like gender over race. And our history of the suffrage movement tells us what happens when we take gender and we still don't have the intersection of race, because in 1920, all women of color got left behind in that suffrage movement, and they were not a part of that. And so if we really look to US history and we ask the question, when did women get the right to vote? If all women, it wasn't until 1965 that that's really true, right? So part of this work, we sort of push on a lot of the things that we were socialized or we grew up with, to really sort of look at our history and sort of challenge our perceptions of the world that we see. But that's sort of like a little side, a sort of side note. But what do we see, right? We saw a history in our nation where we have these beautiful values, whether that's all men are created equal, or of the people, by the people, for the people. with liberty and justice for all, right? And we could talk about mass incarceration and the racial disparities that we see within our justice system. And we would say that the history of America is that she has a beautiful value, but our work is always around how do we make our reality match back to the actual value, right? And so we talk a lot about values versus realities, right? And so not only do we sort of see this at our national level, but we see it at the state and we see it at the local level in local government too. And we would say that equity work is the work in the trenches so that we could actually make our reality match back to these beautiful values that we set for ourselves. And so we can talk about this like locally. You know, I sort of really like to talk about we want Austin to be the most livable country in the livable city in the country, because this is the mission of our city. And when I came to work for the city of Austin, I really fell in love with this mission because I'm like, yeah, I really do want to live in a community that is like most livable in the entire nation, where we're like the best in class. So this is a beautiful value that we have, but I'll throw out to the audience, what could be some gaps in our reality as it relates back to this beautiful value that we have as a city of Austin? So what do we see for our reality right now?
Affordability, food access, losing diversity, economic disparity, homelessness, green space access.
Right. So you all named it, right? And I would say that that's the work in the trenches. That's the equity work. You know, we don't get to be the most livable city until we find out how to close the gaps in all of those areas, right? And so, but our reality is that Austin is a tale of two cities. You know, we've done a lot of work with helping early on, especially with our response to COVID. And we talk a lot about, you know, Austin is truly a tale of two cities. And just to give you some history of our equity office, we were established sort of officially back in 2015 through a council resolution, which required the city manager to develop equity assessment tools. And the council really sort of talked about wanting the city to start to use these tools in decision-making models, and that it wanted to have a better equity lens. But all of that was really a result from a lot of community conversations and community advocacy, because in 2015, we were listed as, I think we were probably in the top 5 for best place to live in America. We were #1 for most family-friendly city back in 2015. And the irony of that was that we were also listed as the most economically segregated city in the United States. And our public health department had actually done a comprehensive community health assessment, and the disparities within our chronic disease rates were just crazy alarming. And so from a community's perspective, especially from communities of color, they really started to push to say, who really enjoys this best place to live in America, right? For which family is Austin really most family friendly? And I think that's really the push or the charge that we have to figure out how to solve as we do this equity work. And I truly believe that it's not just us as an equity office, it's not just us as a city of Austin. It needs all of us, even sort of organizations external to the cities, like many of the companies that you all represent, to really play a part in that. But when we talk about values versus realities and what we experience or that we face in Austin, you can see that before the pandemic, our council declared that racism was a public health crisis. And so what that means for us is that you can sort of see that communities of color are disproportionately working in low paying or hourly wage jobs, makes them unable to provide or interrupt care, more likely to be uninsured, medically underserved areas. I heard folks make comments about food insecurity in our city, less likely to have enough liquid assets to cover basic needs for 3 months. JP Morgan did a study about 2 years ago on the racial wealth gap in Austin. And what really shocked me was to learn in that report that Black and Latino families were actually economically better off in 1980 in this city than they are today, which means that we've actually lost ground over that time. And a lot of the economic prosperity that we've experienced in Austin has not necessarily been shared or made available or accessible to those families, right? So these are all the sort of things that we walk into or that we have to tackle as a city. And then I think many of you all know this, especially from a planning and development perspective, is that so much of what we see today is really rooted in our history. And I think oftentimes many of us, as we've sort of gone through school, we don't like to really talk about race in America. You know, think about how many classes or that you sort of had where you explicitly sort of learn our history, right? I think for me, a lot of the sort of knowledge that I had about history of racism in this nation came in college, and it actually came post-college. I wouldn't even say grad school, that we really learned a lot about it. And, you know, I would say, think about in our schools right now for Austin Independent School District, are our students really learning about the 1928 master plan and how it was a plan that actually segregated our city? And do they learn about the history of how our city allocated resources based upon that master plan versus other areas, how we sort of deemed certain sections of the city hazardous and had redlining? And so people that lived in the eastern portion of our city often sort of had to bear the brunt of anything that wasn't environmentally friendly, all of our industry, all those things. We walk into that history. And so for us at the city of Austin, it's important for us to understand the history, because it gives context and it also begins to get clarity as to why we see what we see. So when we sort of talk about a tale of two cities, we have to look at our history. We have to look at our policy and the decisions that we've made to really be able to understand how did we get here. But I also think that that's key for us figuring out how we do it. And that's really around the process of how we begin to really focus on doing equity work. So I'll sort of give you all a few definitions for today. One of the most controversial things about our office and about when I sort of started as the chief equity officer was that we intentionally sort of made this a focus on racial equity. And we decided that we were going to lead with racial equity. And for us, racial equity is a condition when race no longer predicts a person's quality of life outcomes in Austin. And so we would say, we know that we've been able to achieve equity when we can sort of no longer look at data like childhood poverty, our homelessness, our displacement, and be so reliably predictable based upon race. And we really decided to lead with race because oftentimes it is the one that is most difficult for us to really address. We get the most uncomfortable talking about racism in our spaces, and we can quickly sort of escape and make our focus about other isms so that we can really leave racism behind, right? And so that's why we really lead with that, because it is the most reliable predictor. It is the one that shows up in almost every quality of life data set where we can predict who fares well and who doesn't fare well. We also acknowledge that there are other social identities and other social circumstances that are part of the equity equation, but we would say that we always sort of make an intersection with race that goes along with that. So for example, when I came on board, we did some work early on with our Women's Commission, and they were looking at pay equity within the city. And we actually brought data to them to sort of say that when we talk about pay equity, the data actually revealed that white women made more on the dollar than Black men and Latino men. So if we're going to really talk about pay equity, we also have to have the intersection along with gender, with race, because when you looked at the data, it was Black women and Latinas that actually made the least amount on the dollar, right? And so we always really sort of push that there's an intersection of race when we talk about equity. Another thing about basic equity principles is that oftentimes people may sort of interchange equality with equity. And in their verbiage or explanation of things, they'll go back and forth between the two, but they're really not the same. Equity, you can see on the map, on the graph of equity. I mean, equality is just sort of everything the same, but equity is really about giving people what they need to get to where they want to be, right? And it doesn't mean that everything is going to be equal in doing that. Sometimes we have to do things differently for folks to be able to get them there, and we have to sort of understand, going back to history and the context of what needs to happen. In this case, the boxes that need to be allocated to get everybody to be able to see the game. That is always a good illustration. And I think many of you have sort of seen that. So all this stuff is sort of, I say, easier said than done. And so I think therein lies the question, well, how do you sort of put this into action? How do you sort of begin to sort of shift your organization and really sort of start to focus on all these things, especially us as a city? I think we have like 14,000 employees. We have a massive, massive footprint on the city of Austin. And one of the ways that we do that is that we introduce this framework of what we call is at the center, really trying to get to this equity lens, right? How do we sort of layer this equity lens across everything that we do as a city? And our theory and practice here is that if we can integrate this equity lens, it's really about changing our culture. And if we can sort of look at all the sort of decision-making points we have as a city with this equity lens, we think we make better decisions. We think that we track better data to look at outcomes. We think that we design and develop better policy, all that stuff, right, gets better. And at the end of the day, we should really help to be able to close some of the gaps that we see in this area. But also, I would say, close the gap between our value and our value versus reality of wanting to really make Austin be the most livable city in the country. So how do we do this? What are the ways that we do this, develop this equity lens? The first way that we do it is through what we call normalizing or developing a shared analysis around equity. We lead a lot of conversations internally within the city, but also for the community at large. And we talk a lot about our history of racism for the city. So really sort of bringing awareness and educating people about past city policies. And so that you give better context as to why we see what we see. We also host monthly Undoing Racism workshops, which is a 3-day sort of really deep dive on the history of racism in America and sort of the manifestations of how institutional racism plays out in our organizations. So really helping people sort of have a better analysis of the concepts that we do. We also do Equity 101, presentations for our departments, but we also do it for organizations in the community too. So just trying to really normalize or build a better understanding about our history and sort of how this impacts our lives on a daily basis. We also focus on organizing, which is our constant pursuit of building internal, external partnerships. And so we say equity work is something that is not done solo. If you're going to take this on within your company or your organization, you need a team, a committee of you all, because it's hard work. And so we talk a lot about organizing. I'm excited to be here today because I really want to work closer with AIA. And I think y'all's knowledge, especially around design and development and communities, can really sort of help us do some of the aspects of our work, better. And the time permitting, hopefully we can get to some of that discussion too towards the end. And then operationalizing around equity, which is really what I'm going to talk about today. It's sort of taking a lot of the principles and the concepts and being able to really put that into action within our roles that we do in our jobs. And, how do we sort of develop and sort of design tools that actually sort of help us change culture, but then also sort of, I would say, disrupt us in a pattern of how we do our business. And that's really what an equity tool does. And that's really what our equity assessment process has been as a city. So when I came on board back in 2016, our first line of business was really sort of responding to that council resolution. And it was really to sort of go on this journey of developing the city's first equity assessment tool. And we really did that in what we call co-creative design with community. And we had over 900 hours of volunteer time with community members, a lot of feedback, input around helping us sort of design this tool. And really the sort of center point of a lot of those conversations, especially for our vulnerable communities, was really around historically, what have been the pain points of really sort of engaging and working with the city. And we had community members that would tell us things like, well, the city always says it does community engagement, but really what they do is that they come to our neighborhood meeting and they tell us what they're going to do anyway. And so that's not really engagement. That's just really coming to inform us about the decision that has already been made. Or community would tell us that, well, the city asked us about this long range plan and we gave all of these ideas, but when the plan was adopted and completed, we don't see any of our ideas in it, right? And so all these sort of different areas that we do as city government, people begin to give us feedback on where they thought that there was a disconnect. And that was really sort of the foundation for how we actually sort of developed questions that you would actually see on the tool. Some of the things that we're really proud of with our equity assessment tool is that we were recognized by the Open Government Partnership as a star level intervention for transparency and the potential impact of use of a tool like this in local government. We've actually been recognized by Bloomberg. We have featured as a best practice for the Government Alliance for Race and Equity. And I'm really excited because I've been actually invited by a group called Utopian Tours that's in Italy to actually come and talk to Italian cities about what we're doing with equity and equity assessment tools here in like little old Austin, which I'm really excited about. And we're also really excited that we have 100% of our departments in this equity assessment cycle, which is really what we call a continuous improvement cycle, right? I'll talk more about it, but our goal is to really assess, and from our assessments, we do action planning, and then a couple of years later we go and assess again. So this is like really long range work for us. It's not sort of a one and done. So what does an equity assessment tool do? What does it cover? If you look at the way that any institution or organization makes decisions, we sort of say our opportunity to advance equity, it's always in like the P's. We call them all P's. And you'll probably see the same functions within your company, right? And these are sort of the areas where we often start to get it wrong as it relates to equity. But if we can really sort of zero in on these areas with the equity lens, it represents our opportunity to get it right. And it represents our opportunity to sort of change it, right? And so within our tool, the key themes that we have are really sort of always going back to sort of pushing our departments around what's our line of thinking and how are we making decisions within the P's, right? So for example, in planning, do we prioritize racial equity in our plans? You know, we've actually been having a lot of conversations, you know, recently with the work that we're doing in partnership with Project Connect, which I'll talk about towards the end of our presentation around. We're going back and looking at the history of some of our development plans. For example, our East 11th and East 12th Street Master Development Plan from 1997, and really sort of thinking about, do we really center racial equity in that? If we can look at some of the outcomes of what we sort of saw from that plan, you know, did we get it right? You know, or were there some areas where we may have missed it, right? So thinking about our planning and our design. Procurement and budgeting. I like to really sort of talk to say that budgets are moral documents, right? And a lot of times within organizations, the equity team never has a budget. The institution always says, we don't have a lot of resources. You gotta like scrap it together. Well, really sort of care about it. We should really sort of spend funds on it. And it should really be a funded part of our work and our business. And so do we sort of see that reflected in our procurement and in our budgeting? Personnel is really important. Who do you hire, retain, promote? What does the diversity look like at your organization? And it gets complex sometimes. You know, for us as a city, we have some of our departments, they look very diverse, but once you start to do digging and you sort of disaggregate data by job classifications, you start to see that a lot of times within the city of Austin, we have diversity with frontline staff, but the higher we get up in the job classifications, we often get whiter in our diversity. And so we really push departments on personnel. Our policies that you develop, you know, how do you decide what to propose or what to modify? Do you sort of look at potential unintended consequences in policies that you make? And so this is really happens for us as a city on a daily basis, where a lot of times we may say, we may think something is a really good policy, but then we start to see that as we sort of dig into it, we start to sort of understand that, wait a minute, this could cause an unintended sort of consequence in another area. An example that I sort of give a lot of times is about 2 years ago, the police department came to me and they sort of wanted to ask my opinion about a policy where if they sort of stop someone who did sort of have insurance, that they would impound that person's car because, you know, you have, or a driver's license, they would impound that person's car because you, in effect, you had a driver that was on the road who was not licensed to be on the road or didn't have the appropriate coverage to be on the road. And it was sort of as a way to really sort of cut down on traffic accidents. And it's a policy that on the surface sort of sounded logical, but once you start to ask questions about it, well, what could be all the unintended consequences? We could impound someone's car and then they could lose a job and now they're unemployed and they can't pay the rent and they could be displaced. What happens when we impound a car where, you know, mom has 3 kids in the back? Do we sort of leave them on the feeder I-35? You know, if that happens, right? So thinking about all the different sort of scenarios through policy development, and equity tool can help you do that. Practices and procedures. So, you know, your routines, your habits, and how you follow And then I talked earlier about public engagement, like who do you listen to? And really, are you sort of really centering the voices of those most vulnerable in our community in your public engagement? So we have a process that we go through, and I won't bore y'all with, with that. But if you sort of choose to go down this road and use an equity assessment tool in your organization, we really talk a lot about building a team, getting trained so that you can have a really shared understanding of equity and those principles. And then you can sort of see the rest of the process that we have. Equity assessment tools are really about changing culture. And the tool is an intervention within itself, because as we ask you questions on the tool, it often sort of prompts people to start thinking and immediately thinking about things that they want to restructure or change within their organization. And so our culture, or the values that we really are trying to introduce in our city with this equity assessment tool, is leading with race, which we talked about earlier, and being intentional around how we sort of name racism and talk about it, and how we see it show up in the work that we do, and we sort of see it show up in the community. We also talk a lot about human-centered design and institutional empathy. I think for you all at AIA, I'm sure you all probably focus a lot on human-centered design. And really for us, it's this whole notion of like, if we can sort of center the people in the design and co-create with them, we come up with the best sort of solutions. And I think there's a nuance to this, in that we're really pushing to center the folks that are really most at the margins, that are really most vulnerable in our community. And it's not always easy to sort of get those voices. We're learning that we have to do we have to have a lot of strategies to do that, to sort of help get those voices in the room and help us be part of decision making. And then institutional empathy, I'll talk a little bit about, which is, I think in a lot of our organizations, and I would say our culture in general, we're not always really taught to focus on that. And we're really trying to turn that sort of upside down. There's a scholar, his name is Glenn Singleton. He does a sort of really good training course. Some of you may have actually taken it. It's called Beyond Diversity. And in Beyond Diversity, Glenn Singleton talks about the compass of organizations. And so it's a compass in four quadrants. And he talks about many organizations have sort of a thinking sort of quadrant, which is, our data, our logic, how do we make decisions based on that data? Organizations have a sort of like a values quadrant. And in that quadrant sort of lives all of the mission statements, the vision statements, sort of all those things are part of the compass. The third quadrant is the acting quadrant. And the acting quadrant is around, the strategic plans, the performance data, all the things that sort of drive the action within your organization. But then the last quadrant that often, gets left is the feeling quadrant, or what he says is the heart quadrant. And I would say that I came up through a time where it was like, you don't bring that into work. You can do the thinking, you can have the mission statements, the values, you can do the action planning, the whole feeling thing and the emotional thing, we're often sort of taught to kind of leave that behind. And we're saying we need that in the workspace. And we need it in the workspace because it can often sort of be a stopgap from us doing really harmful things. And in a lot of the workshops that we do with our city staff, we talk about areas in history where government played a real significant role. And one of the areas that we talk about is, think about the Holocaust, and think about all the German government employees who got up every day and did sort of very mundane government jobs that actually aided in the genocide of Jewish people. Think about it, you had planners, you had people that had to coordinate the logistics of the train. You had purchasing or procurement people who had to purchase gas, and they had to purchase the supplies for concentration camps. So think about all the jobs that people got up in the morning. And a lot of times we tell our staff, there are jobs just like the jobs we have. And they carried them out, they stamped the paper, signed the stuff, did all the things. But I would say that the only way that they made it through the day was that they disconnected the empathy of the institution to be able to do it. There's no other way you do a job like that. Can't do it. So we're saying that if we gotta have that in what we do, because oftentimes it's the stopgap from really doing real harmful stuff. So we're trying to kind of bring that more into our space for how we work. So real quick, I don't know how I am on time. I talk a lot. So Steffi, okay, 10 minutes, good. So real quick, like, you know, what are some of the results of our equity assessments that we do? We do a SWOT analysis for our departments. And this is just sort of one that I did at a real high level. Each of our departments, as they go through this process, they'll have their own personalized SWOT assessment, but I just sort of pull some of the areas so that you all can sort of see how we fare as a city in terms of some of the things that we're sort of doing through our racial equity efforts. Our strengths, you know, we have a lot of departments that are really focusing on hiring and training as it relates to equity. We also have a lot of what we call information standards. So standards for document translation and evaluation of cultural appropriateness in the materials that are being produced. So we had a lot of departments that were sort of doing some good stuff around sort of making those things available to the public. Some of the areas that were our weaknesses that really sort of show up a lot for us was data collection and measurement. So lack of disaggregated data, especially by race, ethnicity, and that's really important because we were sort of saying that you can't, if we don't have the data, then we can't clearly see how all of the disparities that are there. And if we don't see them, then we're not necessarily motivated to really try to gap and address them. And so we're having a lot of conversations around demographic data for a lot of the programs and initiatives that we do. And then community engagement was sort of really one of the areas that we want to get stronger. And that really kind of goes back to that human-centered design. If we can really center people who are directly impacted in our designs, then the designs get better. They solve problems better. We should see better outcomes. And then some of the threats that we sort of saw, and I talked about this earlier from a policy perspective, was that well-intentioned policies, but understanding that in the way the policies were designed, really disadvantaged and marginalized groups. So these unintended negative consequences of a lot of the things that we do as a city. So these were some of the themes that come up for us. We have a dashboard that is available to the public, and you can sort of use our dashboard to sort of peer in on departments and see where they are in this process. We're a small team. We try to update the dashboard, you know, regularly, but it's kind of hard for us to do that because we're pulling a lot of places. But this is kind of like a screenshot of our public health department. And you can see that their assessment responses, SWOT analysis, our public health department actually has their action plan in place. So you can see the things that they're working on. We also, for the community, give you a roadmap on staff that has sort of been trained. So this is staff that's gone through racial equity training. And we sort of do this for a community because it's, you know, staff that you could reach out or try to connect with within the city, especially if you have an equity issue as a community that can connect with you and really sort of hopefully better understand the issue, right? And then we also sort of provide things like demographics of the workforce. And we have some questions embedded in our annual employee survey that's featured on the dashboard. So you can start to see a little bit of culture of a specific department and where they are kind of on this sort of spectrum of sort of doing this sort of equity work. We say on the spectrum of really becoming a multicultural, well-functioned, anti-racist organization is what we're striving for. And it starts to give you some insight, culturally on where some of our departments are in the process. And then just sort of like in closing, I wanted to talk about other things that we are working on. And I say equity in action. I think one of the areas that you all will sort of most be interested in is that as with the contract for voters with Project Connect, call for the development of an equity assessment tool that would really sort of be paired to help and prevent displacement from Project Connect. And so we are part of a partnership with our housing and planning departments, our innovation office. We're also collaborating with Cap Metro, Austin Transit Partnership. And we've been on a long journey for this year over the course of 6 months, actually developing the Project Connect anti-displacement racial equity assessment tool. I am crossing my fingers that we hope to actually officially release the tool in the next 2 weeks. And so we're really preparing for that. And we'd love to sort of maybe come back at a meeting and sort of unveil our Project Connect equity tool. And this tool is really going to be centered around helping us sort of make good decisions on how we invest $300 million of anti-displacement funding to truly prevent displacement. And so really helping us make sure that we have the right places that we invest in within the city, making sure that we sort of encompass the right people who are most at risk for displacement. And then purpose is our other area of focus, really sort of making sure that we are funding strategies that people who are most at risk for displacement are telling us that they need. And so in this project, we actually are utilizing 30 community members who are at risk of displacement. Actually, some of the community members during this process were actually displaced. We had a person who actually had to leave their apartment and lost a job and actually had to relocate all the way to Denton, Texas. And so it's real. And we sort of see it play out, and we saw it play out with the community members that we were working with as we developed this tool. So we're really excited about that. And then just over the history, as we've started brought these assessments into the city of Austin, some of the things that we are really proud of is that for our bond proposals, we actually integrated the equity assessment tool in that process, and it elevated projects like our Dove Springs Community Center, which is actually being built, and housing bonds, which we're really excited about too, and much needed for the city. In terms of personnel, one of our wins is that we worked with our Human Resources Department to actually build the city's first equity and inclusion manager and coordinator positions. So we're developing a field of practice within the city. We have departments that are actually hiring their first equity managers or coordinators. And as an equity office central, we actually work in liaison with that staff so we can sort of deepen this work throughout our departments. We're really proud, I think a good success in policy development is that when our library department did their first equity assessment and started to go through the process, they updated all their customer intake to capture demographic data, and they forgave all outstanding fees for youth card holders. And it was really powerful when we were going through this process. We had a librarian tell us a story of a young girl, I think she was a teenager, that would come into the branch and stay always to closing reading books. And she asked her one day, why don't you just check the book out and take it home. And she told her that her mom had gotten a library card in her name, and they lost the book, and they didn't have the money to pay for the fee. And so she couldn't check out any books. And so, at that time they said, well, that's just really not a good city policy, because we really want children to read and be able to access our books and not let money be an issue with that. And so they decided to sort of forgive those outstanding fees. So it was really powerful. And then other things in terms of the other P's, practices and procedures. Our economic development department, they've been kicking butt on COVID recovery and integrating like equity in the COVID recovery. They were actually selected by the US Treasury Department to do a national sort of presentation on best practices of integrating equity with COVID recovery funds. So we're really proud of that. In public engagement, some of you actually may have been a part of our Office of Sustainability's update to the climate plan, where they did this amazing work around centering community members with lived experience and actually compensating community members with lived experience to actually help them update the climate plan, which was an amazing process too. And so I'll open up if we have time for any Q&A.
Thank you so much, Brian, for this the work that you're doing in the presentation this morning. We do have some questions, and I know that we're short on time. So there are a few. I made a list. They were coming in both the chat, and good job getting the chat going. Everyone was communicating well with each other during your presentation. David Goujon asked a question that was reiterated by someone else. It says, what authority or impact does the Equity Office have over other city departments? I know you spoke about some of the collaboration that you're doing, but is there any specific authority?
Yeah, we use influential authority in the role that we do. And I know that I've gotten this question from community a lot. And to be honest with you, I've seen other cities or models where sort of equity is sort of dictated to them. And what happens is that you become the equity police. And city government is very crafty. It understands how to comply with something without ever really doing it. And to be honest with you, when we started this process with the equity assessment tool, we actually made it optional for departments. And what we wanted was that we wanted early adopters. We wanted people to want to be there. Mm-hmm. And I sort of be in a position of trying to force this work on people. And what it did was that it actually helped us build momentum. We had our first 8 departments. We called them the Courageous 8. We gave them awards and really celebrated them. And the next year we had like 16 departments that were ready. And then before you know it, everybody was like, our city manager said, everybody needs to do it. And so everybody was all in. And so I think a lot of times we think that the sort of positional power is really what's needed. I don't always think that this is the strongest form of power to have. So we really tried to use our influential power and our development of people to really be the fuel that sort of pushes this thing forward and create an environment for those who don't, then you get left behind, right?
Mm-hmm. So the follow-up on that question was, is the Equity Office participating in I-35, Palm School District, Project Connect, obviously Project Connect, yes, and the Austin Economic Development Corporation?
So yes, we are in all of those. I would sort of say some of them we're kind of more heavily involved. We actually have a briefing on the I-35, the Cap and Stitch coming up, and we're part of the internal city team. Palm District, we've also working with the planning team as a part of that. I think our challenge sometimes is that we say we're small but mighty, and we're pulled in a lot of directions. We also have a staff person that sits on the Economic Development Council for the city too. And so I think we're still trying to kind of find our way and our strategy within those.
Yeah, great. Someone else echoed that question specifically related to 35 and said, from yesterday's presentation, the proposals seem an antithesis to the P action items. So not really a question there. Kit Johnson wants to know, where do you find information and inspiration specific to making the built environment more equitable? Books, blogs, authors, thinkers.
Say that one again.
Sorry, I'm trying to go fast. We're actually out of time and I see that we're losing people. So thank you so much to our sponsors. Thank you, Brian, for being here. And thank you to our amazing staff and conference committee for making such a wonderful conference for us.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, lots of questions for you. You'll be hearing from us.
All right. Bye.
Bye.